Welcome everyone to the 2024 USABO Semifinal webinar, and thank you so much for joining us here this evening. My name is Julianne Wu, and I will be your host for tonight. First, we'd like to extend our warmest congratulations to you all for qualifying for the 2024 semifinals, and whether you're taking the exam this year or in an upcoming year, we hope you're excited to continue your USABO journey. The 2024 USABO semifinal exam is coming up next week on April 4th, and we know that you might be feeling excited, nervous, or maybe even a little overwhelmed. Tonight, we are so fortunate to have several past USABO finalists with us, who will share their expertise on how to prepare for the semifinal exam, their test-taking strategies, and walk through their thought processes with past problems. We hope that this will be a valuable resource for you, especially in the final stretch before the exam. So briefly, the webinar will begin with an overview of exam logistics, as well as some new announcements. Then we'll segue into resources to prepare for the exam, followed by an in-depth walkthrough of each of the different exam sections. We'll conclude with a live Q&A section, but please feel free to use the Q&A box in the Zoom to populate your questions throughout the webinar. The finalists will be happy to answer your question. Now I have the honor of introducing Mrs. Frame. So Mrs. Frame presently serves as the advisor and consultant for the USA Biolympiad and special projects for the Center for Excellence in Education. Her passion for biology was modeled by her father's example of caring and protecting our environment. Her career has allowed her to share this passion with people in all walks of life all over the world. Currently, her passions are watercolor painting, dog agility with her 5.5-pound Papillon, Gracie, and gardening. We are so fortunate to have her here with us tonight. She is truly the backbone of the USABO, and this competition could not happen without her and all of her expertise. So I'll pass it on to Mrs. Frame.
Thank you so much, Julianne. And I want to echo Julianne's congratulations to each one of you and to the teachers that are also on this site with us this evening. Welcome. I'm going to present just a few brief logistical items and some updates. As you all know, the exam will be a week from Thursday, April 4th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. The exam itself is 120 minutes long, and then there are 30 minutes after that to upload Part C of the exam. So more information about those parts of the exam will be shared by the alums coming up. I want to bring your attention to the USABO student certification. When you log into the Student Resource Center, you will see information about all of the exams. Be sure to click on the student certification for the semifinal exam. Within there, you'll see the honor code. The USABO really holds high on that honor code. Please don't do anything to tarnish it, all right? We just want to know what you know and how much you know. The next part of it, which is very important, are exam instructions. It goes through it step by step what will happen when you when you log in with the Art of Problem Solving. A new thing this year, last year and previous years, everyone had to register again for the Art of Problem Solving's semifinal exam. This year, their engineers are working on cutting down that registration process. And so each one of you will be registered already. All you'll need to do is to log in with your email into the AOPS account and go directly to the semifinal exam page. And on that semi-exam page, what you're going to see is an area where you can upload and download Part C. So practice that several times before you take the exam. Another thing is, please don't contact me or the USABO. We do not handle the technical part at all. The only ones that can handle that for you and quickly are the staff at the Art of Problem Solving. And this is the email, and you'll see it in the exam when you take it. On the day of the exam, what you'll do is log in with your AOPS email address and your USABO ID, and then you'll verify the honor code on both sides of the exam. And there's time for this. It doesn't take away from your 120 minutes. They've allowed time for this. So verify the honor code, put in all the information that's required. Your proctor will have a list of what that is for you, and then take your exam, do 120 questions. You'll do the part C, and then at the end of the exam, make sure that you verify again the honor code, and then get ready for the 30 minutes it may take you to upload your exam questions. When you do part C, it's indicated on that page, practice page as well. There's a long list of instructions on there of what you'll need to have. And later on, Richard will be pointing out some of that information for you as well. So I wish each one of you good luck.
Thank you, Mrs. Frame, for all of the announcements and information, and we hope that that might clarify a little bit more of what to expect on test day. So now Catherine will be going over part A. So Catherine is, oh, sorry, she'll be going over preparation for the exam. So Catherine is a third year in the MD PhD program at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. She competed in USABO throughout high school and eventually, to her astonishment, won a gold medal at IBO in 2017. Outside of research and medicine, she enjoys photography and pottery. So everybody, welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thank you to Julianne for organizing this webinar. So I'm going to talk about how to prepare for USABO semifinals. I know you guys are taking the exam in just a week, and this section is kind of geared towards that population, but also people who might be thinking about taking it multiple times in upcoming years. So just some guiding principles if we zoom out for a little bit. For many people, USABO is a multi-year process. It's quite uncommon for people to make national finals, for example, after just 1 year of studying. So pacing yourself throughout those years is very important. And when you study, you should kind of recognize that even though I'm telling you now to read like all of this stuff and learn all of this content, it usually takes people multiple years to actually master that. So don't feel scared or intimidated by the prospect of learning that all in 1 year or in 1 week. I think the major challenges with USABO are the sheer volume of information involved, and also the level of problem solving. And the volume of information is insane. There's probably, unless you go to medical school or something, not another time in your life where you'll need to know so much at once. And the problem solving is also at the level of like an undergraduate course. So these are all tall orders for high schoolers, but it is possible for you guys to actually master this information. And part of that is anticipating and managing the natural process of forgetting this large volume of information. And so when you create a study schedule or something like that, I would try to build in some repetition, not just move linearly from one side of the textbook to the other side of the textbook, but build in some practice questions and build in time to go back and study things that you've already seen. Along that line, I would also leave a trail of resources for yourself, and we'll talk about that later, but think about your notes and your flashcards and things like that as tangible gifts to your future self when you have to relearn that information at another time. And also, USABO is one of those competitions where a lot of people put in a lot of time and effort to prepare for it, but a much smaller number of people are actually kind of recognized in full for that effort. And that can sometimes seem discouraging, but I want to reassure you that this knowledge base that you get from studying for USABO is actually very valuable in the future if you ever decide to study anything related to biology or even just a STEM field in general. So moving into more practical matters, this is my list of textbooks, and I want to emphasize that this is just my personal list. These are the textbooks that I read when I was in high school, and so there's other options available, and there's other editions available, and sometimes exams vary from year to year where certain content is more prioritized than others, and so this is not kind of the end-all be-all of all textbook lists, but these are the ones that I like. So for essential readings, I think most people know that Campbell biology will sort of get you like 80 to 90% of the way there with USABO if you really, really understand it. And that usually will require you to read it multiple times. So yes, Campbell biology. And people always ask me, what are the parts of Campbell that I don't need to know? And truthfully, there's probably like 3 or 4% of the textbook that's just kind of miscellaneous information. But I think it's too much work to figure out what that 3% or 4% is. So you might as well just learn all of it. It's fine. The other ones kind of fill in weaknesses in Campbell, I would say. So Campbell has really just one good chapter on macromolecules, but USABO semifinals especially will ask more in-depth questions. And so Leninger Biochemistry is a college level text that goes over this information in much more detail and sort of fleshes out the basic principles a little bit more. So I would say the first 10 chapters of Leninger are going to be helpful. They'll go over classes of macromolecules one at a time instead of mushing them all into one chapter. And they'll also go over some basic things like thermodynamics, enzyme kinetics, and that type of content. Albert's Molecular Biology of the Cell is kind of the Bible of molecular biology. It's a really long book, and I've heard people kind of say that, you know, they read all of Albert's in high school, or they feel like they need to read all of it, and that's not true, at least for me. I would say you need to read 2 chapters. They're chapters 8 and 9, and they focus on like laboratory methods and which are not covered in as much detail in Campbell. So 8 is like DNA-based methods, protein-based methods, like your SDS page. And then chapter 9 is on imaging. And so it'll go into things like FRET and like co-localization assays that are useful. And then Raven's Biology of Plants kind of is just a more advanced plant textbook. And I only recommend that people read the last kind of third of it, which focuses on angiosperms. And then what I would consider to be optional readings are Vander's Human Physiology and Klug's Genetics. And the Klug's Genetics, like there's a lot of genetics textbooks out there. Klug's is just the one that I happened to pick up. But I would say that Campbell, the information in Campbell in these topics is most of the time technically enough to get you through semifinals, but it is sometimes helpful to have a textbook actually walk you through all of these things in more detail instead of kind of leaving you to figure it out in a problem-solving way. So Vander's is really good. Klug's I also thought was helpful. And then if you feel comfortable with all of those readings and it's, you know, the week before the semifinal exam, there are some rapid review textbooks called BRS, which stands for Board Review Series, and they're actually designed for medical students, but they'll go over basic principles in biochemistry, molecular biology, and genetics, and there's one in physiology as well. And these concepts are going to be laid out in like a bullet point format, rapid fire, very little explanation, and so they're just good to kind of do a rapid review of the content. And then for some helpful clarifying texts, I think that Biochemistry for Dummies and MolBio and Cell Bio for Dummies are good books because they're catered towards college students who are kind of struggling in these courses. And so you as a high school student who might have never seen this material before is actually a perfect audience for those types of books. Another kind of surprisingly underutilized resource is the World Wide Web. So I think Wikipedia is a great resource for USABO. Obviously, it's not always accurate, but for our purposes, it's good enough. I think it's good for kind of spot checking your knowledge base. And so if there's a particular question that you got wrong, or there's a particular lab technique that you just want to know more about, the Wikipedia page for those are usually quite thorough and well written. ChatGPT is kind of a new one. I think that it's very good at summarizing information that's already pretty well established in the field. So high school level or college level foundational biology kind of falls into that. And so it's pretty good at organizing all this information in a digestible way. And so you can ask it to, you know, explain the major differences between like this and this. It'll come up with a nice list of bullet points, and you can ask it to expand on those bullet points and sort of get like tutoring almost from the robot. But of course, there's always a risk that it's not completely accurate. For topics that are kind of less easy to find resources on, or less easy to find good practice problems on, like genetics and evolution and ecology, sometimes universities will post their problem sets online for those courses. And so those are helpful resources too. And lastly, YouTube is often kind of slept on, but something that people often don't realize is that the struggle that we face as USABO test takers of having to learn a lot of college level biology is actually not unique. There's a lot of people who need to do that in order to like get into med school or just, you know, to like get past their undergrad classes. So there's a huge market for good video content targeting the exact type of audience that we are. And so, for example, if you just look stuff up, you'll find things like memorize amino acids in 9 minutes. That's something that we want to do. Like you can review translation by watching this 10-minute video. You can, if you're struggling with a certain type of genetics problem, odds are some person has solved it for you and written it out in a nice YouTube video. And also for things like physiology, there's a lot of videos where people have like drawn out the concept maps of those topics and just like really fleshed it out nicely for you. So I would use those resources as much as possible to get kind of an additional layer of explanation that you can't really get from textbooks sometimes. You can also create resources for yourself. So taking notes is an obvious one, but when I was in high school, made a lot of slide decks that contained images because there's a lot of USABO questions that involve needing to recognize images, like histologic images or images of different species or that kind of thing. So I would consolidate knowledge in slide decks, and then if I ever needed to go back and like review something, I would just go through that slide deck and it wouldn't take that long because I invested the time to make that resource for myself earlier. So these are just some examples. Flashcards are also great, especially for just memorizing lists of things like B vitamins or amino acids. And I always like to annotate my physical copies of textbooks so that I kind of have a trail of like evidence and like things that I know I might need to come back to later. But you know, some people don't like physical copies. So this is like kind of to each their own, but I found these helpful when I was studying. The major struggle with USABO is trying to remember all the information that you learn. And so I think all the resources I talked about can kind of be used differentially for these different types of information. So one would be list type information, so just memorizing words. And the other type is conceptual information, which is a little bit deeper and big picture, like problem solving in genetics or learning feedback loops and general principles of physiology and big idea stuff. So for the kind of rote memorization, I think repetition is key. So flashcards, slide decks, rereading your notes is helpful. And then for conceptual information, practice problems, drawing things out, and importantly, listening to multiple explanations of the same topic. So if you like read a textbook chapter, read the Wikipedia page on like certain things within that chapter, and watch some YouTube videos, and take USABO practice exams, that's going to like really cement all that information much better than if you just read the same textbook chapter like 4 times. While we're on the topic of practice exams, there's a way I think to make the most out of them. So you want to keep track of questions that you get wrong and also questions that you got right, but you're not sure why you got right, or questions that you got right, but you're like, you know, I can easily see how I could get this wrong if I, you know, forgot this one thing. So I actually like keep a list of all the questions that I get wrong and come back to it sometimes. And also sometimes the answer key is wrong. Like I'll get students asking me like, I don't understand why the answer is the way it is. I really think it's this. And often I agree with them. The answer key is not always right. Um, in addition to just keeping track of questions that you get wrong, it's important to follow up on all the relevant topics related to the question you got wrong, not just the specific fact that you missed. And so with a little bit of an astronomy analogy, like you want to know both the center of your shadow, so your umbra, and also all the surrounding like penumbra of knowledge. So if you get a kidney question wrong, don't just study like that one fact about like sodium or something. Like actually just study, you might as well just study the whole nephron, because getting that question wrong means that that whole area is kind of a gray zone for you. And lastly, I think it's important to save a few exams for timed practice so that you can take the exam under test-taking conditions and learn to optimize your strategy. But outside of doing that like 2 or 3 times, I think it's actually really useful to use the rest of the questions as topic-based question banks. So if you're studying plants, for example, like I would recommend just doing the plant questions of a bunch of exams kind of in a compiled way. And so then you can actually get a sense for like, you know, how good is my plant knowledge instead of like waiting until you take a full-length practice exam to actually get any feedback on whether your studying strategy was actually effective or not. And then another interesting question you can kind of ask yourself is like, how do I know when what I've done is enough? Like, how do I know if I actually know something? And for people who are kind of embarking on this self-studying process for the first time, it's actually like, you know, having mastery over a topic is actually a sensation that we don't actually have experience with at that point. So these are questions that I would always ask myself. So can I teach it to someone else on the top of my head is a good one. And if you might as well just try, to yourself to see if that's true. Can I write a usable question about this topic without consulting a textbook? Is I think a pretty good one. If you think like a question writer, you'll sort of start to engage with all the nuances of the topic and think about like how people can try to trick you within the context of that topic. For pathways, can I draw it out from memory? Can I explain the logic behind certain phenomena? And can I connect these concepts to other ones that I've learned previously and sort of like branch out your kind of mental map of all these concepts? And lastly, obviously, all this stuff takes a lot of time. Learning this amount of material takes a lot of time. It takes people years. And so if you commit to studying hard for the USABO, like if you want to do really well in the semifinals and make national finals and you have aspirations at that level, USABO is going to be a bit of a lifestyle change. And I think there's no way to sugarcoat it. It's just hard to fit in like that many hours of studying per week. And so, sometimes this involves making difficult decisions like, is it possible for me to juggle all these other extracurriculars with studying for USABO as much as I want to? And if doing everything comes at the cost of your own health, then I think it's time to make some sacrifices and decide where your priorities lie. I think one way to kind of make more of the limited time that you do have is to take advantage of the different modalities of resources. So like flashcards, images saved onto your phone, YouTube textbooks, they can all sort of take up space in different times of the day. So for example, like you could watch a YouTube video while you brush your teeth. And you can like do flashcards like in the car or something. And like while you're standing in line for coffee, you can like stare at some images on your phone. I mean, I know that sounds kind of like insane behavior, but it actually adds up and it's kind of constantly keeping you engaged with the process of like remembering things. I would sneak it in when you can, like on airplane rides, long car rides, dinner parties that you don't want to be at. This is all optimal USABO studying time, in my opinion. And you can also give yourself protected studying time if that helps you kind of remain disciplined about it. So like when I was in high school, I would tell myself that I have to be studying for USABO between school ending and dinner, unless I had like other things going on. And that kind of made it so that unless again there were extenuating circumstances, I always had some protected time every day before my like brain got too tired. And lastly, I think you can kind of consider USABO as a sport almost. It has seasons, and there are kind of the off season and the on season, and you don't always need to be studying. You don't need to study during your off season. I think sometimes people will ask like, how many hours a week do you need to study for USABO? And the answer will vary a lot based off of what time of the year it is. Like for me, I would study like maybe 20 hours a week, like in the months leading up to the exams, but then in the spring and summer and in the fall, like I wouldn't really be studying at all. And so depending on like what other activities that you do and what other things you're involved in, like you can space it out like throughout the year according to your own preferences, but you're not really expected to like be doing this 24/7 every single week of the entire year. And on that happy note, I want to wish everybody good luck and feel free to ask me any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, for all of your insightful advice on USABO resources and study strategies. And next, Lynn will walk through part A.
Hi guys, I hope you're all having a great Tuesday evening. I'm really sorry that I couldn't be here virtually. Instead, I'm going to be here virtually squared, and I'm going to walk you through part A of the semifinal exam. All right, so we might have touched on this already, but generally the format in part A is there's going to be around 60 questions, each question multiple choice, A through E. There's going to be exactly one right answer, and each question is going to be worth 1 point. So this is essentially the closest you're getting to the open exam style format with the 50 multiple choice questions. So some common formats that you might see for questions in part A could be like, which one of these answer choices is correct? All of these answer choices are correct except for which one of the choices is not correct. Out of these 4 statements, what is the correct number of statements that are true? or like which are the true statements from 1 through 4. In what sequence does a process occur? And there are going to be some longer problems that you will actually need to read and apply more problem-solving skills to. All right, so I've split up my tips and strategies for part A into 2 main parts. The first part is going to be your strategy for during the actual test taking portion. During the actual semifinal exam, your goal for part A is to maximize the number of points that you get and also minimize the amount of time you spend. So you need to know that in part A, you're getting less time than you do on the open exam. You have less than 1 minute per question, given that you have 2 hours for the entire semifinal exam and 3 parts to get through, parts A, B, and C. So I think I normally aim to spend around 40 to 50 minutes on part A and then move on, because really the meat of the points is going to be in parts B and part C. So that means in parts A, you want to prioritize the shorter questions and the questions that are easier to answer due to eliminations. So that's really going to be all of these 4 bullet points and less of the longer problems. And you also want to understand that in part A, there's going to be a mix of easy and hard problems, but all of them carry the same point value. So really the game here is knowledge. Generally, the questions are going to be around the difficulty of the open exam, generally derived from information you can find in Campbell biology. So the more you can read and the more you can do practice problems means that you'll build a wider knowledge base that will help you answer these questions. Sometimes it really comes down to, do you know the concept that's being tested in this question or not? And then the second thing on top of knowledge is being able to eliminate, which once again does derive back to having a good understanding of what's being asked. But there are really these formats in part A, like the accept, like the 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 statements, where it's really easy to eliminate because you might not know the correct answer, but you know what's not the correct answer. So you can get it around down to 2 possible choices. And then from there you guess, or you use intuition, or you end up kind of getting it in a bolt of lightning later on, whatever works for you. Those are the main strategies you're doing during the test. Really just try to go for the optimization in this lineup here. Maximize points, minimize time spent. Part A is relatively the easiest part to get through, so that's why you want to do the best you can in this part. So that was test taking. Second is in practice. In practice, your goal is kind of the exact opposite. You want to take as much time as possible, and you want to build a really solid knowledge base, because that's the name of the game in part A. You really, when you're practicing, don't want to let any problem you don't understand kind of get away, meaning that if it changes its format, you still want to be able to know the knowledge and apply the knowledge in a way that gets you to the right answer. So that means really understanding why you get things wrong. You can find them in Campbell, read through them again and again, search for information or resources online or through the USABO website, or ask someone who knows the answer. Generally, this is because there are a limited number of concepts that can be tested, but the amount of questions that those concepts can be presented in are infinite. So you really want to dig as deep as possible into understanding what's going on. So that really means spending a lot of time to solidify your knowledge and your conceptual foundations. Understand the concepts rather than the questions. And I know all this can sound pretty overwhelming and scary, and I felt the same way when I was going through this process. It took me a lot of time and a lot of perseverance, honestly. But I also want to say that you guys really do got this. It can be tough, but work hard. Don't focus too much on an end goal. You know, it's really a learning process that you want to enjoy. And I think that'll kind of lead its way towards results in the end. Okay, so these are some sample questions I pulled from the 2018 exam. And I'm not going to go through them in detail because of time, but I want to show you the different formats that I was talking about. And out of these 3 formats, the first one I'd recommend going for is elimination type problems when solving part A. The second is knowledge, and then last, analysis problems. So in all of these 3, we're looking at things where you don't need to necessarily know all of the information needed to solve this problem to eliminate a lot of answer choices, because you know that only one of these answers is going to be like wrong in this case. You know that there's only one correct sequence. So if there are any arrows here that are incorrect, you can basically eliminate those. And same for number 14 as well. So elimination problems, you really are able to maximize your chance of getting that point. The second type of problem is a knowledge problem, where basically there's one right answer, and if you don't know it, you don't know it. If you know it, you know it. So this is where that time and that effort to know as much as you can really comes in. The third type of problem is not only do you have to know something, you also have to be able to apply it in a problem. And there will be less of these in part A. They're more part B, part C material. But if you do see them, generally I would try to jump to the last sentence. That's not going to be applicable here, but I would be wary of spending too much time on this because I think in 1 minute, it is substantially more difficult to get a point in this problem than it is to get a point in any of these other problems. All right, that being said, you guys are going to do amazing. Thank you so much for attending this webinar and for listening to me, and I'll pass it along to the next person. Thank you. Hi guys, I hope you're all having.
Okay, so hopefully Lynn's little segment helped you understand more about how you might want to approach part A. And next, Albert will be going over part B. So Albert is a junior majoring in biology at Stanford University. He was an IBO gold medalist in 2020 and 2021. Albert is interested in biological research, enjoys playing the piano, and his favorite snack is the orange.
Yeah, thank you. Hi everyone. Thanks you all for coming. Thanks to Julianne and Ms. Frame for organizing the webinar, and also as Lynn said, best of luck to everyone. So I'll be going through part B. So part B, I think is around 60 questions too, but the main difference with part A is that as opposed to just one correct answer, like typical multiple choice questions, in part B, a lot of questions you can just select more than one correct answer. And so that'll be indicated on the answer sheet. And so you'll see this in questions when they say things like select all that apply, select the correct options, etc. But it should be made clear in most questions, I think. And and another difference is that there's 2 points per question instead of just 1 point, to emphasize that these questions are kind of more difficult because you can have multiple correct answer choices. And another thing is that, at least for this year, there's no partial credit in part B, which is kind of a common question. I think when you think about how to answer questions where there can be multiple answer choices, another thing that comes up with part B is that there are often kind of long texts or big figures kind of leading up to the actual question. And so I think some ways to think about how to approach this is, for example, you can think about the answer choices. Some of them will just be just prior knowledge. And so the question will just ask you to recall some fact or ask you to kind of analyze some information. And that'll just be based on prior knowledge that you have learned. There are also other questions that are just analyzing the figure. In some cases, they're purely just analyzing the figure, in which cases it would do you well to kind of read the figure carefully or read the text carefully and not necessarily that much prior knowledge. Or I think in most cases, it's kind of a mix of both. So maybe you need to know some prior knowledge, but also need to read the figure carefully. I think one important thing to keep in mind, though, is that even though the question might be about a specific thing, a specific molecule or something like X, you may or may not need to actually have encountered X before to solve the problem, because in many cases you can just use logic with the figure based on some prior knowledge you have about some other things in general, about a similar system, a similar pathway, something like that. And so oftentimes that's what the question writer is trying to get at when they mention X, is not that you're supposed to know X, but that you're supposed to use logic or reasoning or knowledge surrounding it. And a final kind of point is that even though there's kind of multiple answer choices, some answer choices can still contradict each other, and so you can still use process of elimination to some degree. And so an example here is this problem from a recent semifinal exam. It says, what the following are the traces of action potentials of 5 and 50 picograms per liter of hypocretin, an inhibitory neurotransmitter. And so select the correct options from below. And as you can see, A and B clearly contradict each other, and so you should probably pick one or the other, right? And I think this is another example of something where you don't necessarily need to know you don't necessarily need to know details about hypocretin to answer this question. For example, if you're looking at part A and part B, you can see that in part A, the neuron is firing less than in part B. And so since hypocretin is inhibitory, as they told you, then part A is probably the neuron where more hypocretin was applied. And so that should be the 50 picograms per liter versus part B. And so you should probably select B, right? And I think for part C and D also, you don't actually need to know anything specific about hypocretin, but just knowing generally that kind of voltage gated ion channels are kind of very important to action potential propagation no matter what, and that neurotransmitters generally do not block them, and they generally bind to ligand gated kind of ion channels or other types of receptors. And yeah, this is just the question bigger. And I think if you look at the answer, you'll see that you didn't actually have to know so much about hypocretin itself, but just kind of use logic based around reading the figure carefully and kind of like knowledge about neurotransmitters in general. Of course, it might help if you knew about hypocretin, but yeah. And then so I think if you think about questions for long texts, I think there are many strategies for how do you kind of go about questions with long text, especially when you're kind of time crunched in the exam. And I think one useful strategy that I used often was to kind of first read the general gist of the question, like see what is it about, like the kidney, or is it about kind of a protein? And then after that, but without going into the specifics of the text, first read the question statements, know what they're asking about, and then go back to reading the long text while focusing in particular on what the question statement is asking about. This is so that this keeps you focused while reading the long text, and since there's usually a lot of fluff in the long text or big figures, kind of just extra information added in, this allows you kind of put that away and then kind of focus in on what you might actually need to answer the question and kind of analyze it as you're going through the statement on the fly. And then another important point is that these tests are usually a time crunch. I think rarely do people finish with extra time, and even if you do, it's usually kind of a big time crunch. So it's important to keep in mind how you're doing on time. So for example, if you have 5 minutes left and there's like 50 questions left to do, you probably don't want to spend like 2 of those minutes reading through the entire text of one long question. Maybe you can just skim it or just move on to the next question or something like that. But if you have more time, maybe it's a good idea to read it just to make sure you're not missing anything or fall into any traps or things like that. And so this is an example from a recent test as well onto kind of how you can kind of quickly go through a big kind of long text and figure. And so for example, here you might read the first kind of statement and see that it's about kind of proteins, and if you look at the figure, it's about kind of like a genetic pathway, and you can see that it's about cell cycle regulation. And then if you read the question statement, you'll see what is the DNA content of a mutant somatic cell that has constitutively active PRB. And so you could kind of read the entire text and kind of, get the details of all the different proteins involved in this regulation. But you could also kind of look at the figure. This is, the quicker way. You could look at the figure and see that if you have constitutively active PRB, that kind of inhibits E2F, which is what kind of the T sign means. And then E2F activates, which is what the arrow means, kind of in these kind of diagrams. E2F activates the transition from G1 to S. And so you can see that if PRB is constitutively active, then E2F will be inhibited or inactive, which means that the cells will stay in G1, which means that they should be 2N because they're somatic cells. And so really, if you were short on time, this would be kind of just a really quick way, maybe in like 30 seconds or something like that, or even less, to kind of just go through this question and select B as the correct answer without having to kind of read everything in the figure and understand what's going on. Yeah. And so, right, and the question is, yeah. And then I think another kind of related thing is that read the text and figures carefully, but recognize when there might be only certain parts of it that are relevant to the question. And I think a good example, so in here it says, consider the following pathway, which describes the degradation for toluene, a kind of this molecule. And then, there's a gist that it's kind of harmful to humans. And then it says here clearly that most likely you have never seen this pathway, but apply the general principles of energy metabolism. And so the question writer is saying that you don't need to actually have known or know the details of each step in this particular pathway, but just kind of looking at this figure, what can you kind of derive from it based on your prior knowledge? And so if you look at A, the first step in the pathway, number 1 is an ATP generating step. So to enter part A, I would definitely just kind of look at the first step, and I probably wouldn't look at the other steps. To answer part A, I would just, okay, at the first step, it's using up NADH, and ATP is not involved. And so I would say that it's not an ATP generating step. And it's also, NADH is an energy source. And so it's also against, that's also against it. So I could just cross off part A and very quickly, kind of just by looking at the first step. And then in part B, it says the first step is a redox reaction that oxidizes the toluene, but you can see that it's oxidizing the NADH. And so it's probably reducing the toluene or the other kind of components of the reaction. And so you can kind of cross off part B quickly And really to answer these two first parts, you don't really have to, like the other parts of the figure are not that relevant, right? So you don't have to pay that much attention to them. For part C, it says the product of the toluene degradation pathway is probably further degraded using the TCS cyclone beta oxidation. You kind of have to recognize that at number 2, this is acetyl-CoA that's being shown. But once you kind of see that, then you can see, okay, beta oxidation is what is used to degrade kind of fatty acids that create acetyl-CoA. And so a C would not be true, right? And then so for part D, you can kind of see that this is a toluene degradation pathway, so it doesn't make too much sense that these would also have to kind of use toluenes as monomers to create some other chemicals. And also I think the question text kind of implies some sort of this toluene is a harmful chemical, and so bioremediation might be an important thing. So part D doesn't seem too correct either. And so you could select E, which would be the correct answer. And I think the point of this is to say that even though there's a big figure and a big text, based on the question statements, you can kind of see what the question writer is trying to ask you, and just kind of focus in on the things that you need to focus on just to save time. Yeah, and so that's part B. And part C is kind of the last section of the test. I think there are 2 parts. The first part is the multiple true false, which I'll go over, and then the second part is free response questions, which Wembo will go over. And so multiple true false, this is a question format that's common in the IBO, which is I think the main reason why we tested on the semifinal exam. And so I just wrote an example here to kind of the format of the question. It's, animals are important clearly, and identify the following statements as true or false. So there'll usually be 4 kind of statements, and you can either choose true or false for each one of them. And you can indicate this on the answer sheet. And so for this one, like the dogs are animals, yes, apple trees are not animals. And the other 2, you can also kind of test yourself on that. And so, yeah, it's not too different from part B, I think. But I think one difference is that there is partial credit for these questions. Yeah. And so it's generally similar, I think. They might also have long question texts or big associated figures, etc. I mean, some of them don't, but some of them might. And so I think similar advice as part B applies in that regarding how to kind of quickly go through figures and get what's important, or how to keep in mind the amount of time you have left and things like that. So yeah, best of luck with the exam, and I'll hand it over to Wembo.
Thank you to Albert for that insight on parts B and C. Next, Wenbo will be going over, like Albert said, the FRQ portion for part C. So Wenbo is a first-year student in the Harvard MIT MD PhD program with a strong research interest in applying mathematical modeling and innovations in the context of cancer biology. He went to undergrad at MIT, where he studied chemistry, biology, mathematics, and literature. In his spare time, he enjoys drawing, writing, and going on hikes with his dog, Juniper.
Thank you for that introduction, Julianne, and thank you for having me, Mrs. Frame. And so I'll start by saying some general advice. First of all, by the time you get to part C, if you're doing the exam sequentially, you may feel rushed. It's not uncommon. But the key thing is really don't leave things blank, or you might miss some easier points, because there's sometimes like some of the questions may just be fill in the blank based on historical precedent, or like choosing the correct letter and then justifying. So really think about that when you're pacing yourself through the exam. The key thing is, again, these are things that you may not have explicitly seen before, but rely on applying what you know. And that is kind of where you, if you're prepping for part C, thinking about like where you might focus your studying. So looking at the previous year's practice exams, looking to see what you were expected to know versus what, formulas are given to you. For instance, you are generally expected to know how to compute means, variances, degrees of freedom, transformation efficiencies, and etc. But yeah, generally other more complicated formulas will be given to you. And the key point, and I'll demonstrate this with the practice questions, is really quickly identifying the core concept that you need to apply, and then isolating the key text in the question stem from like all the additional like background information and filler text. Yeah, and so some additional thoughts. This will benefit both you and the graders, so just really try to be concise. You want to maximize points, minimize time, so write as little as necessary to actually answer the question. Don't spend time writing like words or, justifying things that don't really address the question, because that won't earn you any extra points, and it'll just be kind of more difficult to grade. And kind of I'll apply things from Campbell Biology just to kind of demonstrate how essential this resource is for the practice questions. But if you do additional reading, again, feel free to kind of use everything that you have acquired. So for the first question, this is a 45-year-old woman who is complaining of constant mild headache and lost peripheral vision. And the blood work notes high levels of prolactin. And so immediately, next slide. Yeah, immediately from that question stem, I've highlighted some key things. Fortunately, the question stem here isn't super long, but the first thing to kind of note is that high levels of prolactin should get you thinking, like, what is this question really asking me? And what kind of abnormality might this indicate? And then the additional symptoms obviously may come into play later. And so for part A, what pathology could cause all these symptoms and signs? The key word is what, right? Like you need just identify the thing, right? You don't need to justify it. And so the thought process that I would recommend is first identifying the key concept, endocrine system, right? Prolactin is a hormone. And then thinking about kind of what gland makes prolactin. That is the anterior pituitary. That's directly from Campbell. And then, so what other information might you know, right? Like you have mild headache, loss of peripheral vision. So that might lead you to suspect there's something, perhaps something impinging on structures in the brain, or perhaps increasing that intracranial pressure causing the headache, right? If you have a structure growing in that brain. And so to answer part A, then you can put all that information together and say there's a tumor in the anterior pituitary. In this case, it may also be a prolactinoma, which is also, if you know that term, but if you don't, it's totally fine just to say it's a tumor. And so part B is now where you're going to justify your diagnosis. If you justified in part A, you were, that was not required. But here, like, make sure to key in on what's mentioned in the question stem so that you address the question fully. So your headaches, right? It's the tumor that's leading to a rise in intracranial pressure. The loss of vision, the optic chiasm is above your anterior pituitary. So if you have some sort of mass growing there, that could impinge on that visual field. And then the elevated prolactin, tumors just kind of secrete excess prolactin. So that could be a valid justification. And then kind of part C is maybe a little bit outside of necessarily directly what Campbell might be able to tell you, but you should be able to use what you've learned from Campbell to kind of deduce the answer. So first of all, we're talking about the anterior pituitary. So you should be thinking, okay, what other hormones does the anterior pituitary make? And again, directly from Campbell, TSH, ACTH, LH, FSH, GH. And MSH a little bit, not super important. But then you can think about, okay, this person has hyperglycemia. That means there's excess glucose in the blood. So what could cause that? You could have elevated thyroid function, or you could have elevated glucocorticoids from the adrenal cortex. And even if you didn't know about Cushing syndrome, you could think about, okay, like how do I discern which one of these is actually at fault? And recall that hyperthyroidism, if you have excess thyroid function, that actually causes weight loss because your metabolism is going to increase overall. And that is from Campbell. So again, like by process of elimination, you should be able to kind of determine that ACTH is the key thing that is defective. And that acts on the adrenal cortex to make glucocorticoids. So again, make sure to address all the hormones and what it acts on. And then again, name 3 other hormones. Fortunately, you thought about this already in the previous question. So acceptable answers are just exactly those that are produced by the anterior pituitary. And I've listed all of them here, but you should really only name 3. There's no extra credit for naming more. And if you name things that are contradictory or wrong, you might actually lose points. So don't do that. And finally, the last one is just pick one of the 3 that you kind of listed and describe the effects of increased level of that hormone. So again, the key point is you pick one and you describe the effects. So by the effects, we're talking about like symptoms or like what impact that would have on the person, right? So let's say you have elevated TSH, you have elevated thyroid function. Hyperthyroidism isn't an effect. That would not actually get you any points. But if you talk about the symptoms like weight loss, muscle weakness, hypertension, etc., then you can get those points. And similarly, again, just pick any of the ones that you feel the most comfortable describing. All right, and then the next question is kind of a more quantitative question, testing your understanding of muscle fibers and the sliding filament model. So again, immediately you see this really large block of text, and I recommend that you like really like go through and like highlight or like underline things that like jump out to you. So first of all, like skimming really quickly, underlining sliding filament model. Then like, background information, and then the last sentences of each of those paragraphs tells you some crucial amount of information, which is just like information that's given to you that may be useful to answer the question. So for instance, the first piece of information is that the force is proportional to the amount of overlap between the thick and thin filaments. So maybe I want to use that for my justification. And then the next one is it has been determined that the maximum velocity depends only on the intrinsic speed at which the myosin heads can complete one cycle of the cross-bridge formation and release. Again, that seems like something that is just explicitly given to you, so you can think about using those things in your justification. And finally, really crucially, identifying like what the question is, right? The question is ultimately, what happens if you set the sarcomere length to 1.6 micrometers, and which of the curves given in that second graph corresponds to the proper force velocity curve, right? And the key thing is that like you have to support your answer for each choice. So it's not sufficient to just give, the right choice and then like why that is without explaining like, why it's not A, why it's not B, and so on and so forth. Again, you're not expected to have learned the length tension relationship, but you should know how to apply the sliding filament model in chapter 50 of Campbell. So next slide. Again, this is just like, the knowledge that you're expected to kind of apply, but if you look at the diagram on the right, there's some level of optimal overlap, right, between your myosin heads and your actin filaments. If your sarcomeres are too short, you kind of have all this like excess actin that's not being bound to myosin. And if your actin filaments, or if your sarcomere is too long, you kind of have a lot of myosin heads in that central H zone of the sarcomere without it actually interacting with the actin. So again, this is like the conceptual framework of thinking about like this question. Yep. And then so as a sample rationale, the correct answer for this question is C. And the way you can justify it is by saying, okay, look, the tension velocity graph, right? That where do I see, right, where the maximum tension is? And that's where the velocity goes to zero, right? Because like if your velocity, if you have even greater tension than like, then beyond that point where it x intersects the x-intercept, then it's not actually going to be able to generate any like force because the velocity is zero. And so if you look at the x-intercept, that will tell you where the maximum force that can be generated by a particular sarcomere length is. So just reading the graph, right, like never having seen this before, you look and you say, okay, well, curve A is generated at 2.1 microns, and then the curve that I want is generated at 1.6. So you note that the tension, maximal tension that can be generated is reduced. So any curve that has an x-intercept of greater than or equal to the curve, the x-intercept of curve A is automatically incorrect. So that includes curves B, A, and D. And then now you're kind of left with curves E and C. And here the crucial difference is noting that they have different y-intercepts. And what does that represent? That represents the maximum velocity, right? And we know from the question stem that the maximum velocity is an intrinsic property of kind of how the myosin heads interact with actin. By just changing the sarcomere length, we don't expect that intrinsic biomolecular property to change. So therefore, E cannot be correct because you've now changed that maximum velocity. So C must therefore be the correct curve. And notice how we've justified that answer and answered the question of like, going through each choice through this kind of process of elimination thinking. And with that, I will hand it over to Richard to explain grading of this part.
Okay, so thank you, Wenbo, for teaching us how to kind of approach the types of problems you might encounter in Part C. And now Richard will be going over some of how the scoring for Part C works. So Richard is a freshman at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology who plans to study computer science and bioengineering. He enjoys meeting with the MIT Chess Club and watching movies with friends in his spare time.
Yeah, thanks for the great transition, Wenbo and Julianne. Also, thank you to Julianne and Mrs. Frame for allowing me to be here today. So I'm going to go over how we are going to be scoring your Part C FRQs. And first of that, I would like to go over how independent review works. So basically, we have 8 graders of Part C who split up into teams of 2 each. So we have, for example, if there are 4 parts to Part C, then we would have a team of 2 work on the first part, a team of 2 work on the second part, and so on. All tests are anonymous to graders, and we would like to keep it that way because we do not want to introduce any bias into the scoring process. So please do not write your name or any personally identifying information. Make sure to follow the instructions, basically. So don't put your AOPS username, put your USABO ID number, your SF, and the semifinal question number. So I just basically took a Google form and tried to show how you would upload a PDF. Basically, it's just going to have an upload place. You just click on it and you can upload a file from your computer. The formatting that I have in the image here is 126.1.1. The intention was in previous years, the next part C question is just the next number. This year, I'm not totally sure how it's going to work, so please follow the instructions on the exam itself for labeling the question number. Yeah, so in general, we look for clarity and conciseness, as Wenbo has previously mentioned. Basically, we want your answer to be obvious, to us, so we know what we're grading, and also short, so that we can grade it fast and we can make sure that we're grading what you intended to write. Most importantly, you should be answering the prompt. Of course, a correct answer is better than no answer, and a correct answer is better than an obscure answer. So a sample question I just wrote quickly was basically if there's an equation question, they just ask you to, here are some values, please calculate the value of here it's km and show your work. So if it says show your work, explain or something like that, then you have to explain every step you take in the process. So in the sample response I have, first you explain why you're getting the value that you're getting. So why are you getting the new km of lactase? You're getting it because there's competitive inhibition going on, which is given by this equation. And by using that equation, you then explain that you get a certain answer, which you provide. So basically, you need every part of this process. You need first why you have a value that you can just put into an equation, and then what that equation gets you. So there's 2 steps here. Probably if this was graded, it'd be 1 point for the first part, 1 point for the second part, for example. Next slide. And most importantly, you should know how an answer is phrased. Basically, what is the question asking for? So there are certain question endings that ask you for either just the answer or all logical steps that you need to get to the answer. State only the answer, for example, neuraminidase or cytochrome C or whatever it is, just straight out. If they ask you to name something, if they ask you what or which, or if they ask you how many. Basically, those questions, we're just looking for if you get it correct. Another type of question would have show your work, why or explain, or why is this? And basically that would ask you to show every single logical step you take. And what's most important in that case is that we can follow your logic. Even if your logical steps don't match exactly with our rubric, we will be going over the rubric as we grade. So when we break up into teams of 2, each pair is going to go over every student's response together, and until they reach a consensus, then they'll give a grade for that paper. And after they get through a couple papers, they'll go back and double check to make sure that they're grading consistently. And if the rubric needs to be revised, for example, if a student has an answer that the graders haven't considered but deserves credit in some manner, then the rubric will be updated to reflect that. And so that's why we need a very good logical thought process for us to understand what your answer is saying and why it's saying what it is and why we might want to accept it. And on the right, I have a warning. So basically, a question might have both stating an answer and also taking logical steps. For example, the sample question is, if eucalyptus trees were not serotinous, what would be the result on the proportion of eucalyptus trees following secondary succession? And briefly explain your response. So you both have to say there will be a lower proportion, so that will be perhaps 1 point, and also explain why there will be a lower proportion in addition to that. So if you don't go through the question carefully enough, you might miss one of these keywords. I suggest looking for the keywords to make sure you understand what you need to respond to the question with. Next slide. Yeah, so I have a couple examples prepared, not that many, but these should just show you what you should be doing. So this first FRQ example that I just wrote will get a 0 because they do not have their student ID, nor the question number, and also they did not I'm actually not sure what the uploading process will be this year, but whatever Ms. Frame has said, either upload them all together in like pages or to each place where you're supposed to upload each page. That'll be how it is. But regardless, this FRQ example is just completely wrong because you have all the answers on one page. And most likely you would be needing to submit these to individual questions. So either you have different PDFs going to each question, or you have them all in like pages, like page 1 for question 1, page 2 for question 2, depending on how the question asks you to write it. Yeah, and so that's why this example, although like all the answers written are correct, but it would not like receive credit. And so I'm gonna go over like 2 examples. So one is just you just write the answer and we check if your answer is right, and the second is going to be going through the logic of your answer. Just a brief reminder, these 2 FRQs that I'm going over, 2014, 2017, are going to be the same as the ones from Wenbo's examples. So I'm not going to go too deep into how you solve the question, but rather how we are grading it. So for the first question, prolactinoma, I believe parts 1, 3, 4, and 5 are also actually all just you state what the answer should be. So for 1, I just opted to put prolactinoma because I know the term. It's better to put keywords or terms that you know, because it makes it much easier for us to just look at it. And also, it's much clearer than just like anterior pituitary tumor, although that is like also a very good answer. So here, either prolactinoma or an anterior pituitary tumor would both get full credit. Depending on what kind of answer you would put, we would grade it like partial credit. For example, if you just put pituitary tumor or you put anterior pituitary malformation or something, you would probably get like half the points. So make sure to always put something, even if you're not sure. But if you put something that's just wrong, like posterior pituitary, then you might not get points. Yeah, so that's how we grade just like it is what it is answers. There are also logical answers, basically when you need to explain how you got to an answer or how you got to or just explaining why something is that way. So an earlier example was for explaining how you got to the answer was the calculation question earlier. This question was basically explain why the anterior pituitary tumor would cause the symptoms that are explained in the problem. So as Wenbo explained, it sits directly beneath the optic chiasm, and thus it would apply pressure on the optic nerves, causing peripheral vision loss. So that would be like one section because it asks you to explain 3 things. So you would write that, and then you would also write this mass causes elevated CSF pressure, which could result in headache, and also it secretes prolactin, like elevated prolactin levels would directly result from that. And so how we would grade this is we would just give you +1 point for each part of that question, for example. In this question, it's fairly straightforward. We just give you 1 point for each explanation of each symptom if it's correct. Not much to read into that. And it's better to just keep it short, concise. You just say it is this way because reason. And you will not get any more points for writing more again. And if you write anything incorrect, like let's say you say and to the first part and you say and the anterior pituitary could also affect like the thalamus or something, then unfortunately you might not get that point depending on how erroneous your statement is. So that's how like taking off points would work. So make sure just to write like what you think is correct, especially since you don't have a lot of time to go through part C. I believe that's all I have. Okay, I have one more. So for 2017 FRQ1, there were 2 parts to the question. The first was identifying the correct curve. So they asked you to say like which curve is correct. It's obvious, as we went over, it is C. So that'll be 2 points on the rubric. And then most of the points usually, however, are for explaining how you got to that answer. And so how you would get to the answer is first, there would be a rationale for deducing like what the maximum afterload or the tension is for each curve. And that would be based on the Sarcomere mechanics that Wenbo mentioned from Campbell chapter 50. So you have to understand both that maximum velocity is intrinsic and afterload or tension is proportional to cross bridges, which means that it has to do with the x-intercept. So first you would need to explain that. I'm guessing it was like maybe 1.5 points because the whole rubric was not provided. And then you would go on and explain why that rationale means that the graphs y-intercept and x-intercept are as such. So maybe you get 0.5 for each. Or yeah, and then for the last part, you need to identify basically for A, B, C, and D because they ask you to support your answer for each choice. Go through each one and explain why it is correct or why it is incorrect. Here, I just think it would be like 0.5 for each because you need rationale for your previous work. So we do give partial credit for every step of the process. If you have a different logic process, if it's also correct, we will create like another rubric for it probably. And so you can be sure that your answers will be graded correctly. You're going to get partial credit for every part that you do correctly. So don't feel afraid to write something, but this also does not mean you should write random things. And every question will have a different ask. So going back to the part where I mentioned how you either name something or you explain it, here they particularly ask you to support your answer for each choice. If you don't notice that they ask this particular thing, you just say it's C because this. Even if your logic is right, you're going to lose points because you didn't explain for every single answer choice. Yeah, so that's my input. You just have to make sure you read the question correctly, you write your answers clear and concise, and that you answer directly to what the grader wants to see, basically. That's all I have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you again to all of the speakers for all of their insightful information. And now we'll open up the floor to our live Q&A session. So I think that one common question has been about how Part C should be uploaded. So I'll allow Mrs. Frame to kind of clarify that once again.
Part C, whoops, sorry about that. Part C is into 4 sections. All right. And this particular one that we have, they're labeled Roman numeral 1, Roman numeral 2, Roman numeral 3, Roman numeral 4. In past exams, they've been labeled A, B, C, D. But this one, they have C, Roman numeral 1, and that's the whole set of questions with that. And under that, there'll be like a question 1, a question 2. So all of those questions will be contained in that first section. And Albert, Wenbo, anybody, feel free to clarify more with what I'm explaining, all right, if I'm not doing it clearly enough. But all of that is one particular question with several different parts. And when you put your answers on that sheet that Richard was pointing to, make sure you label which part of that question it is, all right? So all of like Part C, Roman numeral 1 will have all of its questions in one place. Then you'll do another separate sheet for the Roman numeral 2 and all of its different sections, and 3 and 4. Can you add anything to it, anybody, to help with that clarification?
So
Richard?
there will be one upload like place for each of 1, 2, 3, and 4.
That's my understanding, all right?
Okay, okay.
They've been changing the game on me, all right? So that's what my understanding is now. I haven't seen the practice upload page, and that would be very important for all of you to take a look at when you log into Art of Problem Solving. All of you should be registered by March 29th, and I encourage you strongly to go and practice upload. It'll tell you exactly the process they're looking for. All right, and also on the teacher, on the Student Resource Center, there's step-by-step instructions in that student certification that tell you how to do it. And if I get more information, clear information, I'll send each one of you an email with that as well.
Okay, so hopefully that clarified a little bit more about how Part C will work on test day. Another question that we received is, how is scoring for the multiple choice section done?
Yeah, I can answer that. So for part B, there is no partial credit. So if you get all choices correct, then you'll get 2 points. If not, then you'll get 0 points. For part A, well, it's also if you get the correct answer, it's 1 point. If not, then 0 points. For part C, for the multiple true false, there is partial credit. Like if you get 3 of the true false correct, there will be some number of points. I think maybe 0.6 or something like that. If you get 2, there's some number of points. So something like that. Yeah, I don't think is a penalty for incorrect answers unless that's not true, but yeah.
No, there is not.
Okay, cool.
I think we are a
Oh,
little.
can I answer what someone's saying? What is registered by March 29? When I started out, I said that Art of Problem Solving registered everyone. This year, in past years, you had to register yourself for the semifinal exam. So every one of you that are semifinalists will be registered by March 29 and will have access to the practice page in the semifinal exam section. Thank you, Julianne.
Okay, yes. So unfortunately, we're nearing the end of our time. So thank you so much again to all of the panelists for all of their wisdom tonight and their time this evening. And we hope that you were able to learn a lot and also feel a little bit more confident going into the semifinal exam next week. Again, like Mrs. Frame has said, please remember to do like the practice segment on AOPS, I think on March 29th, so that you have a lot less stress on test day. And also the recording for this webinar is going to be posted to the CEE YouTube channel, and then the link will be emailed out to all of the registrants. So this is the end of the webinar this evening, and good luck again to all of the competitors.
Good luck, everybody.